Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's live broadcast, Can AI Beat Cancer? Presented by Marty Tenenbaum, founder and chairman at Cancer Commons. I'm Alexis Krause of LabRoots, and I'll be your moderator for today's events. We are delighted to bring you this educational web seminar presented by LabRoots. LabRoots is the leading scientific social networking website and producer of virtual events and webinars. Before we begin, I'd like to remind everyone that this event is interactive. We encourage you to participate by submitting as many questions as you want at any time you want during the presentation. Just click on the Ask a Question box located on the far left of your screen and type your questions into the drop-down box that appears on the screen. We'll answer as many of your questions as we have time for at the end of the presentation. If you have trouble seeing or hearing the presentation, please click on the Help Desk button located in the promotional board at the bottom center of your screen, or use the Ask a Question box to let us know that you're having a problem. This presentation is educational and thus offers continuing education credits. Please click on the Continuing Education Credits tab located in the top right corner of the presentation window and follow the process to obtain your credits. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Tenenbaum. I will now turn the presentation over to him.
Hello. Today I'm going to talk about AI and cancer from my unique perspective as a computer scientist, an internet entrepreneur, and a cancer survivor. I'm going to talk about 40 years of AI research on cancer, which has resulted in thousands of papers published and lots of demonstrations, but very little clinical impact. And then talk about what I've been trying to do to fix that in Cancer Commons, an organization that I started to help patients get the best possible outcomes and continuously learn from every patient. And in the end, to talk about how you can contribute to this mission in order to be able to make a real difference in terms of saving lives. I think the potential exists to save hundreds of thousands of lives a year, starting immediately with the tools at our disposal and the drugs at our disposal. Almost 20 years ago, I was diagnosed with wicked cancer, metastatic melanoma to liver, and given like 9 to 12 months to live. This was in the era before there were all these checkpoint inhibitors and so forth. I went around to lots of different doctors. Everyone told me something different. And the only thing these docs could agree on was that the prognosis was dire. So what to do? And this is a situation that hasn't changed much in 20 years. In fact, it's gotten more complicated because there are many more good options to choose. But in the end, I bet my life on a clinical trial, and that clinical trial failed. But I was fortunate to be on a long tail of exceptional responders. And so I dedicated the rest of my career at that point to take my skills as a computer scientist and internet entrepreneur and use them to try to help other patients going through this kind of decision where you actually have to sometimes make a decision, often make a decision in real time, within days, a life or death decision with not the information that you need to make the best possible decision. 20 years later, the situation, as I said, is really pretty much the way it was then. People get diagnosed, they go into a panic, they go consult Google. It says something like 1.7 million results came back. And I can guarantee you that the first 20 pages or 50 pages of Google results are not going to be what you need, because Google is good at many things, but finding a needle in a haystack, that one study that gives you the possibility to save your life is not going to be there. This is the paper that saved my life, and in fact, the doc who saved my life. And I never would have found it if I was just Googling for metastatic melanoma to liver, because this paper wasn't published in Science or the New York Times. It was published in some annals of surgery. And it would have been very hard to find. So this is part of the disconnect between an extraordinary amount of information that gets published every year and the information that a patient or a doctor, for that matter, needs in order to make an informed decision. This is, I just got back from ASCO, a couple of days ago. It was last week. And this is the annual meeting. There's 10,000 people in this room, so if you can picture it going back as far as it can, and they're all listening to some sages on the stage talking about, a few cancer trials. And this is, anything discussed on that stage is going to be, 3, maybe even 5 years behind what you'll hear in hallway conversations. And then once it's published, it'll take another 17 years or thereabouts to diffuse through, continuing medical education, for example, and conferences, and ultimately a patient showing up with something that they just took on off the web, asking, Doc, what do you think about, this treatment or this trial? For it to diffuse out into, the front lines of oncology, say in West Virginia or some other rural place. And this is, this stuff needs to change. And AI is the way it has to change and the only way it's going to change. And this stuff has consequences. Medical knowledge, treatments, and results fall off very sharply as you move away from the elite cancer centers and out into the community, and then beyond community practice in urban areas, out into the rural communities, the disadvantaged communities, the third world communities. And the screen on the picture on the right shows how it varies across Europe for the same cancer for patients diagnosed. And if we can just get everyone up to the level of the best, we will already have saved hundreds of thousands of lives a year. And if we can then raise the level of the best for everyone, we save countless more. The challenge is that no one knows the optimal way to treat any cancer with the drugs that we have available. And you need to let this thing sink in for a second. The reason is because these drugs are seldom tested in regimens, cocktails, or head-to-head with each other even. And as a result, there are so many plausible ways you can imagine using the 2,000 cancer drugs that we already have that no one knows how to figure out an efficient way to search that space. And search is one of the things that AI was born to do. To show you something about to illustrate the tremendous combinatorics that we're talking about here, what you're seeing is cancer as it was maybe 40 years ago at the beginning of the war on cancer. So cancer was a 10 by 10 disease. Along the bottom are, lung, breast, colon, all the major organs. That's the way cancer was characterized. And up on the vertical axis are the 10 or so chemotherapies that kept getting recycled over and over again across all these different cancers. So you had a 10 by 10 experimental matrix. There are about 1 million cancer patients a year who are, eligible for clinical trials. And so you have 10,000 patients a box, 1 million patients, 100 boxes, 10,000 patients. You can run plenty of clinical trials. Today, the situation is quite a bit different. There are thousands, perhaps millions of molecular subtypes of cancer. No one really knows that for sure. And the vertical axis now has, thousands, maybe tens of thousands of plausible combinations and regimens of drugs that might be useful for treating cancer. So we have somewhere between 100 million and 1 billion boxes. No one really knows for sure, but still, fortunately, only 1 million patients. So if you do the math, there's approximately 0, or in computer science, we would say epsilon patients per box. And you can't really run trials anymore. And you can't, and big data doesn't work for the same reason. There's not any big data in those boxes. And to put it even more sharply, let me ask a rhetorical question, which is, how much data is there on something that hasn't been tried yet? And if you think about that for a second, you'll recognize the limitations of all of the big data approaches that people are doing to try to understand cancer. Not that data isn't important, but that there simply isn't any data on things that haven't been tried yet. So what I'm going to be talking about is using AI not to analyze big data, but to figure out what data we need, and then to be able to plan an optimal series of experiments, sequential hypothesis testing, in order to be able to get the data that we need as quickly and efficiently as possible. And we can base these experiments on all sorts of knowledge, including preclinical data, causal models if someone has them that they can run, experimental preclinical results, high throughput drug screens, for example, or most importantly, what the experts at the top places are thinking about in terms of the experiments they want to run. So and we'll get to that in just one second. But first, I want to comment that cancer is a very, very hard AI problem. And you've all heard about, in the headlines of all the things that cancer and that big data is being used for nowadays, including winning games like Go and chess and so forth, where the best, experts in the world are computers now. And so if in a game like Go, the situation is that the rules are fixed. They've been fixed for thousands of years. There's plenty of data. There's perfect simulations. If you need to play experiments, which is, playing games, that's pretty cost effective to do. In fact, you can play it against yourself all night long and learn. So the fact that AI can win Go, there's a lot of things going for it that make it easy. Similarly, driving, which is self-driving cars, is another major win for AI in recent years. And we're getting pretty close to commercial offerings. Google drives cars around my neighborhood here in Silicon Valley all the time. But there, the rules of the road have been fixed for like almost 100 years. And we have, again, plenty of data and perfect simulations. We can simulate things, and getting people to drive cars around is not that expensive. But if we get to cancer, the situation is quite a bit different. First of all, there are no rules. Cancer makes its own rules, and it's changing them all the time. There's very little data in terms of treatments and outcomes that people are willing to share in any case. And as I pointed out, very little data on the interesting things that haven't been tried yet. We don't have good simulators. The best simulators that we have are mice. They're neither cheap nor fast. They give you results like in months if you're lucky. And whether those results are even applicable to people is hard to say. And experiments are very, very costly in terms of both dollars and human lives. And so we have to, look at man-machine approaches. So now getting back to what do you do when you don't have, good data or good studies on which to base your experiments. And that is you turn to the best minds that you have and find out what they are thinking and try to tap that. And today you see experiments happening all the time in oncology. They happen in community oncology offices where docs are talking to patients and figuring out some experiment to do. And no one is in the room with them capturing that. If you're lucky, some of the thinking will get into the patient's record, but that of course is protected by HIPAA rules. And most importantly, in major cancer centers, we now have these molecular tumor boards that are springing up everywhere. And here, not just physicians, but also often scientists and computational scientists covering the bioinformatics are discussing the toughest cases, and virtually nothing is captured. And so this is a problem. And so the first thing that we need to do is to get into these rooms and try to capture the information that's happening. Every day, these experiments are going on. People are thinking about and trying things, and no one is capturing this information. All of oncology, in fact, is an experiment, if we're honest about it. And these experiments are not planned, they're not coordinated, they're not observed in any central way, and therefore very little is learned from them. So this is the opportunity where AI can make a huge difference. Okay, let's go back to the ASCO meeting. If I had a recurrence of my cancer and I went up to the front of this room, I would want to not have people tell me about the results of trials which have taken 5 to 10 years and then another year to report out at an ASCO meeting. I would like to say, these are the details of my case. Does anyone have any ideas about what I should do? And by the way, not just in this room, but in the whole world. So the questions, there are basically three cases that can happen here. Number one is somewhere in the world, an expert knows what's best for me. It's just not my doctor. And how do we make that connection from where the knowledge is to where it needs to get to? Number two is no individual knows, but collectively the community knows. Someone may know, what targets to hit given a molecular profile of my cancer, and someone else may know what drugs are appropriate to use for that target, or maybe a clinical trial that they're running that my doc doesn't know about. So if we can connect the dots, then we have an opportunity to do that. Number three is to where there's no one in the community who knows the answer, but collectively we know what's the next best thing to do. Maybe if we had some view of looking at the entire community and could see that some people are thinking about something and over here some people are thinking about something similar, maybe we could put those pieces together and know what experiment to run. So if I look at these things, organizing the world's knowledge, connecting the dots, which is inference and learning, coordinating the search for new knowledge, these are not, cancer or bio research problems. These are very hard AI problems, and they have the potential to save many, many lives a year if we can, in fact, solve them. And I would go so far as to say they're the only thing that can make an immediate difference of that scale, being able to exploit better the resources, the drugs, and the tests that we already have. Okay, so that's the context. Now let's move to look at what AI has done so far, because these are the building blocks that we will be using in new ways when we get to the third part of the talk. So my colleague Jeff Schrager and I, about 10 years ago now, wrote a paper for the AI magazine, which is the magazine published by the AAAI, which is the AI Professional Society, in which we laid out the opportunities for AI and cancer. And for anyone who wants a comprehensive review, the challenges that we laid out and the approaches to them are still as applicable today as they were then. So take a look at this paper in AI magazine. I think it was in the summer of 2011. And the paper concluded by talking about the grand challenges, the grand challenge that we posed to the community at that point, which was organize the world's knowledge of cancer, use that to be able to plan and coordinate the treatment experiments that are being done every day in oncology, integrate the results so that we can increase our knowledge of both cancer biology and the drug mechanisms, and then generalize that knowledge so we can apply it to many, many more patients. And this challenge turned out to be a lot harder than I thought. I thought in these current last 10 years that we would have gotten there. But in fact, we're still far from achieving these goals. So let me go back to something more fundamental, which is to try and give you some sense of what AI can and cannot do today and in the near future. So speaking generally, what AI does is take data in the various forms that it's shown here and knowledge as we might get from experts or literature or other sources, and be able to use that knowledge to build models. And these models can be represented in various forms. They can be statistical models or rule-based knowledge or plans or what have you. Build models and then use those models in conjunction with real data from an actual patient in order to be able to do things like diagnosis and treatment planning and being able to monitor response, recommend people to trials, all those sorts of things which AI does. The very first AI, and I should say that in addition to clinical applications, there are preclinical applications, many of them, and AI is being used throughout the industry increasingly to do things like target discovery and molecule design and molecule optimization and treatment validation and so forth. I'm not going to be talking about those preclinical applications directly today, except as they may be relevant in certain clinical applications. For example, in terms of being able to find targets in a given patient and drugs that might be recommended for them. Maybe we can repurpose some of those. And if any of you out there are working on such applications, I would really like to hear from you if we can find a way to repurpose them clinically. The very earliest expert systems, the very earliest AI applications were expert systems, which the very first of which was Oncosyn, which was done in Ted Shortlift's lab here at Stanford. And these systems used handcrafted rules in which the experts would put down what conditions they were looking for, and based on those, what they would recommend, and used for being able to make treatment plans for oncology patients. And these systems are now 30 or 40 years old, and they're still in use today, and they're still very, very good in terms of capturing what experts are thinking in a narrow domain of discourse and being able to apply them to a given problem. They're used all the time in diagnosis, for example, of equipment and machinery, and they're used throughout medicine. That said, they are not very good at handling uncertainty, and learning is all done manually. Namely, you learn something, the rules change, you have to go back and you have to edit the rules, and these rules typically interact with each other. So the editing becomes a huge mess, and that's what I mean by knowledge management. And as a result, expert systems are limited. The current paradigm that we're talking about is using big data in order to be able to train the models, and these largely statistical models. And big data is very good at things for which there's a lot of data. For example, radiology scans or pathology slides, or even being able to do medical diagnosis and treatment planning in narrow contexts where you have a lot of data, which is not cancer, where the interesting things haven't been done yet. And so the challenge with these systems are they don't work very well in situations where you don't have a lot of data, and they don't provide explanations. The neural net says that this is best, so that's the answer. And that's basically a non-starter if you're really trying to use these things seriously in a clinical setting. Third wave, which is one that is just emerging now, and you'll be hearing more about it, is using statistical techniques to be able to invoke models which are in the form of programs. And these programs can be run and make predictions and compared with the environment. And based on that, we can do learning in much the same way that a child does, using small numbers of examples and being able to reason about why my program isn't working correctly and debugging the program. And there's a lot of theories that that explain how children might be learning in this kind of way. So if you have small amounts of data, you want to be able to explain how things work. Probabilistic programming is a paradigm that you should be looking into. So as I said at the beginning of this talk, there have been 40 years of research, thousands of academic papers, but very little clinical impact. And the reasons are actually straightforward and not all that much directly related to the abilities or lack thereof of AI, but rather all of the contextual things that need to get done. Integration into physician workflows and their EHR systems, knowledge management, as we talked about earlier with the expert systems, clinical validation, which is actually seeing how well the results compare to traditional docs doing their things, which can take quite a while to do, and therefore haven't been done very much. And that's one reason that we don't see widespread clinical adoption. And then simply all of the issues that are involved in productization and marketing of these systems, so that they are not research demos, but there's something that could be used in a physician's office by someone with minimal training. And we're beginning to see some progress on that last front. In particular, if we look at where oncology is going, we're very close to the time when we are going to be seeing, and routinely in cancer, because of the focus on precision oncology, patients getting really quite comprehensive molecular panels, which will cover, DNA, RNA, proteomics, and so forth. And then being able to take the results of that and put that into models of molecular pathways, and in fact, even more sophisticated models that will model what's going on in a cell in a mathematical way so that we can try to predict what's going on in the cells of that patient. And then doing sophisticated treatment planning, which can involve, tests, sequential, trying to map out not just what the patient does next, but sequentially what options are opened or closed based on each thing that they do. So there's a kind of planning and look ahead, which is, again, something AI is very good at. Being able to run tests, preclinical tests, either in a dish or in an animal or in a computer, as to whether, how well that's working. Being able to apply the combos and then be able to monitor in real time. And I would say that in support of this new paradigm of precision oncology, there's an emerging ecosystem with many hundreds of companies that are developing systems and software for being able to deliver the services that I've talked about. And every one of these companies, you can bet, has a team that is doing something that involves AI. And often this is marketed with a lot of buzz, but there's a lot of stealth behind it. I don't really know what's happening, neither does anyone else yet. And so these are what we have to look forward to coming on stream in the next few years. But, and here's the caveat, just like no one knows the optimal way to use the drugs we already have in combination, no one knows the optimal way to use all of these tests and treatments. And at the end of the day, we need to find a way to optimize not just the drugs, but the tests and treatments to create regimens or treatment pathways, if you like, that are optimal for each patient. And that's the challenge that we will need to be facing. So I'm going to add two more things to the issues that I talked about a second ago, which is how do we integrate all of these emergent AI capabilities that not I'm developing, but that all of you are developing in your companies into regimens. And then how do we create a rational marketplace whereby all of these capabilities are out there in a way that people can discover. When I was walking the trade show at ASCO last weekend, there was no way anyone could keep that stuff in their head. It's just a completely dysfunctional marketplace. So we need to create the marketplace first and then try to standardize all these things so that they plug and play, so that the output of someone's molecular profiling is then the input to the next person's tumor modeling, target identification, and that is the input to someone's treatment planner, and so on and so forth. That's what's needed in order to be able to turn these capabilities into something that is a scalable approach to using AI to solve cancer. Which brings me to what we're doing at Cancer Commons. Cancer Commons is something I started about 10 years ago with the explicit goal of helping patients and their physicians find the optimal treatments for them, and to learn as much as possible from each patient's experience to inform the next patient. So you can imagine that if we do deep research on behalf of one or two patients, that research might benefit 100 or perhaps 1,000 additional patients that have similar cancers. We disseminate the information to the front lines as rapidly as we can, not in 17 years, but in real time in response to queries about what do I do to help a particular patient. And then we try to coordinate all of these treatments in order to maximize learning. More on that in a second. Cancer Commons' premier service up till this point has been a free service that we offer, supported by philanthropy, which provides one-on-one consulting, second opinions, if you like, to cancer patients who have exhausted the standard of care. So these are patients who are out of options and are looking for new treatment guidelines, and we fix them up with our internal experts and provide them recommendations, often recommendations about clinical trials, which in a very deep way are matched to their particular molecular profiles and whatever other criteria they bring in terms of patient preferences. In order to be able, and we've helped so far a few thousand patients, interestingly in 40 countries, and I know this webinar is global, so if you have patients and you would like to consult Ask Cancer Commons, the service is free. And it's very highly regarded by the patients who have benefited from it and their physicians. But scaling this is a challenge, and I've already talked about one way of scaling it, which is reusing results. Another way is to build out a network of external physicians, and we are in the process of doing that. We have about 100 physicians that we can refer cases to now and moderate discussions among them in order to be able to facilitate if there's people are not agreeing, to try to drive consensus, which is unfortunately often the case in oncology because this stuff is really as much art as science. What we're doing beyond that is building a network that will tap into tumor boards first in order to be able to capture these cases and pooling those cases with our own Ask cases to build a knowledge library, and then building partnerships with advocacy groups and industry in order to be able to disseminate, be able to reach far more patients and disseminate the knowledge much more widely. So we're going to now use the Cancer Commons network in order to be able to solve the problem that I was initially put up there. And just to remind you, everyone knows the optimal to use available cancer therapies. And this I posed as a very high-dimensional search problem in which probabilistic planning, search, and optimization problem, which AI is uniquely poised to solve. So what we're doing is expanding the Cancer Commons network into a national and ultimately a global network that will turn oncology into a virtual trial, and I mean that in a very specific sense, which is a way to be able to learn in the course of real-world evidence, to be able to learn from all patients on all treatments all the time. To be able to build out this network by starting with molecular tumor boards and elite cancer centers, and then expanding that out so that everyone is part of this network, using it in order to be able to find out what is the optimal treatment for each patient, to get help in adaptively planning the treatment for that patient based on the experiences of all the patients that have come before them, in order to be able to come up with the best treatment for the current patient, and then to be able to coordinate all of those experiments to be able to maximize collective learning. That is, if you have individual experiments that are going on and everyone's, for example, trying the same thing, you don't get a lot of learning. If we can distribute the experiments across the community and then be able to very rapidly replicate the successes and discard the failures, and when there's truly a split decision, to be able to run the experiments, this is where we are using AI to be able to do this planning and coordination and knowledge sharing. So the first step is building out the knowledge network. And as I said, it is combining our own network, which is in the lower left, with the lower left, let's say the left, with the molecular knowledge tumor boards on the right. And by the way, industry itself can inject hypotheses into this mix with appropriate conflicts disclaimed. But the goal is to be able to get all of the hypotheses that ought to be tried so that they can be openly discussed and evaluated for each and every patient. Then to be able to use probabilistic planning. Remember we talked about probabilistic programming a second ago, to use probabilistic planning in order to be able to coordinate the treatments across all the patients to maximize learning. Very simple example, again, is if in looking at all of these different discussions, we see that 2 people want to try something over here and 3 people are talking about something related over there. we can very quickly organize a case series, because none of the centers may see enough patients individually, but we can do that and be able to drive learning in this kind of pop-up cohort way. And the next step beyond that, which we are gearing up to do but are not doing yet, is to be able to coordinate all of these experiments globally to maximize information gain. My colleague Jeff Schrager likes to equate this to a air traffic control system for biomedicine. And the analogy to the air traffic control system for airplanes is actually pretty apt. Namely, in air traffic control, we have coordinated teams of experts and algorithms who are trying to coordinate all the flight plans of these planes to be able to get a lot more planes through a given airspace efficiently and safely. And nothing like that exists in cancer today, but we think the opportunity is there to be able to do that. So here we are at 30,000 feet. Let's dive down and see what happens at the point of care. And this is basically the outline of the way this works at where the rubber meets the road, is at where the patient is being treated. So we have, if you like, starting with a patient presenting to a molecular tumor board. This tumor board, based on the characteristics of the patient, is going to get recommendations from the Bayesian engine, maybe 3 or 4 top recommendations, which are produced initially by experts, because there isn't a lot of data, although if there is data later, we'll be able to combine those two. Importantly, they will get not just the recommendations, but the rationale for those recommendations. And they will be able then to be able to pick the recommendation that they like and go treat the patient. Or interestingly, if they don't like, and we will ask them, when they pick one, to tell us which one they picked and why, because that's how we learn. And importantly, if they don't like any of our recommendations, they can pick one that they like better and tell us why, because we'll certainly learn that way too, as well as how it worked when they tried it. And that puts new knowledge continuously into the system. So the way this now works is, if once the tumor board has made its decision, captured the rationale, the left arrow is the rationale that's being captured into the knowledge base, and the right arrow is go treat the patient and capture the data on how it works. So over time, we're taking knowledge from the knowledge base on the left, running experiments that are mediated by the tumor board. We're not trying to practice medicine, we're just giving them suggestions. But the suggestions are such as to drive consensus or coordination in a gentle way that lets them still be docs. And then capture the data so that over time we're turning knowledge into data, which of course drives more knowledge, and the loop closes. All the stuff on the bottom of this picture are basically setting up the Bayesian priors for running this experiment. So the knowledge is being seeded from the literature and clinical trial results, and the data is being seeded by various databases that one can get one's hands on, as well as increasingly on patient on data that the patients themselves are contributing. So based on this, we are piloting both the virtual tumor board network and the virtual trials in brain cancer. And we're currently seeing about 5, 6 patients a week. And we hope to be able to drive this up to 100 patients a month by the end of the year. We are also piloting it in pediatric medulloblastoma simultaneously. And to put a face on this, this child, Errol McDowell, is really struggling at the moment, sad to say. And his parents are very successful. They were the founders of Airborne, which is the cold remedy that you can pick up in drugstores. And they went on CBS television with this plea. They said, "We have all the money in the world. Can we get someone to develop a cancer treatment for our son?" What they are now doing is sponsoring the running of a virtual tumor board for their son and others who have similar grade 4 medulloblastoma. And this is generating leads. And these leads go far beyond the typical, handful that a given oncologist will give you. There's now several dozen of them, far more than any one patient can do. And so the opportunity now is to be able to take these leads that were generated for one patient and be able to distribute them in this coordinated way across the community of all kids with medulloblastoma so that they can collectively explore the space far more efficiently than they could as individuals. Again, in this spirit that if something's working, we send more patients there. If it's not working, we send patients somewhere else. And we run the experiments that need to get run in order to be able to resolve equipoise. So what this means in terms of what we're doing is simultaneous cohort analysis, because these cohorts are dynamic, they're changing all the time, treatment planning and experiment planning, surrounded by a platform which is adding knowledge sharing and coordination on top of the usual data sharing that is common in cooperative groups. I want to also show you a few slides on what the air traffic control control panels look like. And this is the app that we're using to coordinate these virtual trials. What you're looking at is a screen that was designed in the spirit of a kayak travel app, so that if you put a patient in, you'll get precisely that one patient out, but you can move the sliders in order to be able to relax the age or the months of that you've been surviving since your diagnosis, or biomarkers or what have you, and thereby get a set of patients. And what this is showing at the moment is the sliders as wide as possible. And there's looks like there's 700 and something patients in this database. And then you can move the sliders to correspond to a patient which is receiving the standard of care for a newly diagnosed patient, which is basically that they have partial resection, or as much as resection as you can have, radiation, and Temodar. And putting that in, there's 11 patients who have been treated that way in this database. And here they are, all 11 of them. And if you mouse over these treatments, the horizontal axis is months of survival, and the vertical axis is independent living score, which is surrogate for quality of life. So what you want are the 3 dots, the linear dots in the upper right, which are, the people who have lived the longest and the best. And if you mouse over those, interestingly, you can begin to see things that are already informative. All those patients shared one thing in common, which is that they all received intraoperative chemotherapy. A wafer was implanted at the time that they had surgery, and that eluted drug locally, and that seems to make a difference. 2 of these patients were actually on the same drug, and so that bears further scrutiny. But unfortunately, all of these patients, are now deceased. This, GBM is a wicked cancer, of which there are at most 5% long-term survivors. So more is needed. And so this is everything I've shown you so far is looking retrospectively back at data. Let's now look prospectively, which is what the virtual trial is fundamentally about. And what you see here are for the same cohort. Basically, these are what the expert recommendations are for those patients on a slightly different scale. The horizontal scale is not months anymore, but just simply efficacy. On a scale from 0 to 100, relative efficacy, where Temodar, the standard of care, is 50-50. And similarly, the vertical axis is safety, again, with Temodar 50-50 being the standard. So all of these dots, which are all clinical trials, as it turns out, are judged to be at least as safe as Temodar and more efficacious for this particular patient. If it was me, I would go for the orange dot on the top, which might not be the most efficacious because this is all forward-looking, just crowdsourced rankings, but certainly the safest. There's been a perfect safety record for that particular drug. So this is where the predictions, the planning comes from, and then the goal is to turn that into data so that this thing runs as a closed loop. One final display is this cancer map. which is another way to look at the data. This is all the patients in the database matching a certain setting of the sliders. So there's a particular cohort. And these are all the things that patients in that cohort did from the starting point, which is where they are at this moment in time. Some went up, some went down. Green is better than brown in terms of outcomes. Thicker lines are more patients than thinner lines. So this kind of flow diagram is a very interesting way to be able to look at the entire air traffic control system and see what all the patients are doing and how well it's working. And this is what we can use to be able to plan treatments in an effective way, including being able to say that, if you have two treatments that you're contemplating, do them first A, then B, rather than B, then A, if in fact reversing them kind of gets you out of the inclusion-exclusion criteria of the trials you want to be in. So one order works, you get 2 shots on goal, the other doesn't. Those are the kinds of things that we're trying to do here. I might add one last thing, which is that ideally, AI can be used to be able to match patients into cohorts. Show me all patients similar to the one I have. It's a very hard problem because there are, multiple dimensions along which you might want to match. Sometimes age is important, sometimes it's not. And there are countless other parameters. That's why we're using a kayak-like model, because what we're doing is building a base of training data with people providing the matching. This is the cohort I want. And we will use that in order to be able to train clustering algorithms, which we're hoping to do starting next year. And that's the design philosophy for much of what's going on in this system, this man-machine system. Now, going back to all of these companies that are designing stealth AI, we need to integrate those into this process. And again, there's countless combinatorial ways of being able to integrate tests with each other and tests with drugs. And no one on the planet knows how to do it. And therefore, all this needs to be incorporated into the kind of search process that we're using. And people will be experimenting with tests all the time, just as they do with drugs. We're going to learn over that space as well. But this is the reason why my colleague, Jeff, says that cancer doesn't need a moonshot. It needs an air traffic control system just to be able to do something that no one on the planet knows how to do. Which brings me to the final part of the call, and this is where you all come in, because Cancer Commons is building an air traffic control system, but it's not something that any one organization can do. And certainly we are not in a position to build all the things that need to be controlled within this air traffic control system. So the key pieces, as shown here, the knowledge sharing piece, the coordination piece at the level of the pop-up cohorts, the virtual trial, the global coordination to maximize information gain over all those experiments, and then the decision support where the rubber meets the road. Michael Jordan, professor at Berkeley here in the Bay Area, has published a piece recently on Medium that is actually quite provocative, talking about the fact that for people who are building planetary scale knowledge systems, and this is the type of thing I'm talking about in medicine, but you can imagine any systems in commerce or transportation or science or what have you. All of the issues that are talked about on this slide, being able to deal with what are the main things that need to be integrated, what are the APIs for those, what are the rules of the road, what are the standards for being able to integrate these things into workflows and be able to build on those workflows, et cetera. This is a discipline in and of itself that doesn't exist today, needs to happen. So for those of you who are into building informatics platforms, we can certainly use your help in trying to make this part of the platform more robust. And we are creating an industry alliance which is bringing together everyone that is on, ideally everyone on the floor at ASCO who has something to contribute to helping patients, so that we can work together to figure out how to make all this work within the context of a global air traffic control system. So that leaves me for a call to action. And this is something that I am going to ask each of you to think very hard about what you have that you might be able to bring to the table that can be helpful to patients and helpful to your company to see integrated with other services in a way such that we can optimize patient treatment. So first of all, if you are running tumor boards or associated with an institution that does, we would love you to consider joining the Knowledge Network. My email will be available at the end of this presentation. I would love to hear from you. If you are interested as a physician or as an institution in participating in virtual trials in order to be able to maximize learning, and this includes investigator-initiated trials for those of you who would like to be able to very quickly have us help you find people who are interested in your questions that can pull together studies much more quickly than you could on your own. Please let me hear from you. If you have services that might be helpful to patients in the spirit that we talked about in terms of helping understand the cancer or plan the treatment or be able to validate the treatment preclinically, we want to integrate your tests into the system and provide you with real-time feedback on how well it's working to inform treatment. So there's a lot to be gotten by being part of this. Let me hear from you as well. If you have data that you're willing to share into a data commons, this is not my primary focus. There's lots of other people who are trying to build data commons. It's very hard to get people to share data. I don't quite understand why. People seem much more willing to share the knowledge at the level of tumor boards, which I think is much more valuable than the raw data per se. But for whatever reason, I'm going to make a suggestion. And I would like to hear from you if you have comments on this, which is that all of the databases, all of the data that people are compiling that they want to sell for, quote, big bucks to pharma or to payers or to Wall Street or to whoever, very little of that data is being used for clinical purposes. And we could set up a federated database, if you like, where you hold on to your data, you're not really sharing it, you're not destroying your business model of aggregating it, let's say, and sharing it and selling it to whoever you want to sell it to, but use your data as part of a system where we can go out to everyone who has data and say, ask some standardized queries that are clinically relevant, such as, based on your data, how would you treat my patient, A, B, or C? Right? That's the type of question you can answer. It won't disturb your business model. And if you would like to be part of that network, we know some technology that exists for being able to do that and do it in a way that, in fact, will increase your odds of selling your data to someone because the federated queries are just the flip side of aggregating your data, pooling it to be able to generate something that's much more valuable that could be sold. And if you would like to be part of that kind of network, let me know. And finally, as I said earlier, if building infrastructure is your thing, we could certainly use help on that front as well. So I will close then with a couple of takeaways. First of all, as I said, if we're honest, all of oncology, advanced oncology, is an experiment, and one that's today unplanned, uncoordinated, unobserved. We might as well do all those things and not just learn something, but maximize the learning so we don't get into situations where we're running 2,000 checkpoint trials, which is just confusing for the patient and very, very inefficient for the system as a whole. No one knows the optimal way to use the thousands of treatments that we already have. Not all of them are approved for cancer. Some of them are used off-label, but they have to get used in cocktails and regimens in ways that there's just exponentially more interesting things to try than there are people. So we have to be very thoughtful about the way we run these sequential experiments, and AI was just made for that. Third, cancer is primarily not a big data problem, at least the way I'm defining it. The goal is to use the AI to figure out what data you need and how to get it most efficiently. Experiment planning again. The best source of guidance at this point in time, at our current state of knowledge, is to go ask the experts and see what they're thinking, but to do that in a way that drives consensus and then tries to coordinate across the experts in order to be able to drive things more efficiently. And cancer doesn't need a moonshot. Well, maybe it does, but the point is that what I'm talking about is completely, basically green space. Everyone's trying to invent the next drug. And no one is trying to think about how to optimize the drugs that we already have, which is a big, blind spot. So closing, so in the end, I asked the question, can AI beat cancer? It certainly can't cure cancer, but can it help individuals beat cancer? And my answer there is not yet, maybe not ever, but we can certainly save hundreds of thousands of lives starting immediately, because we're not trying necessarily to even invent new knowledge or new drugs. We're just trying to put together the things we have in a much more efficient system that can drive individual outcomes and maximize collective learning. Secondly, AI will transform everyday oncology into a virtual trial that's continuously learning from all patients. And that's very, very important, simply because the number of patients are far fewer than the number of things you might want to test. So you have to be very efficient, and AI is the way to do that. And finally, AI can't do anything by itself. It needs to be tied into the cancer world. And I'm trying to do my best, but I need your help, and I urge you to join forces. So thank you very much, and I'm eager to hear your questions.
Thank you, Dr. Tenenbaum, for that informative presentation. We will now start the live Q&A portion of the webinar. If you have a question you'd like to ask, please do so now. Just click on the Ask a Question drop-down box located on the far left of your presentation window. Type your question into the box that appears on the screen and click the Send button. We'll answer as many of your questions as we have time for. So let's get started. Our first question is, what are the implications of the recently passed right to try legislation on What Your Initiative?
So I think what the questioner is thinking about is that in order to be able to run the experiments that we want to run, the key is being able to get access to the drugs. And that is very, very difficult. Often there are certainly, ways that the FDA has opened up pathways like compassionate use, expanded access, and people, and the FDA is very proud of the fact that they approve 99% of the applications that come to them. But the pharma companies and the biotechs that make these drugs are reluctant to release the drugs through these pathways for various reasons. They don't want to screw up their pivotal trials, which will lead to registration with some side effect on an uncontrolled population. But also, the FDA kind of either explicitly or implicitly, the companies are scared of how the results of these off-label experiments or out of protocol experiments are going to get used. There's tremendous interest, however, on the part of patients, and Cancer Commons through our Ask service every day. I get requests from patients, not just for advice on what to do, but how to get access to the drugs. And the patients are struggling here. And I think that, if there's anything that Right to Try is going to do, it's going to create tremendous interest on the part of patients who are out of options in trying experimental options. I believe these companies are going to get overrun with requests. And I think that, Right to Try, in some ways, is fundamentally no different than expanded access, because it doesn't require the companies to make the drug available. If they want to, they can. But I think that if we can do Right to Try in a responsible way, and by that I mean capturing the treatment decisions, the rationales, and the data that results in this kind of real-world evidence setting, that we can actually use Right to Try to move the field much more forward by coordinating all these Right to Try experiments. And the challenge with Right to Try is that the legislation really requires almost no reporting other than adverse events. And so we need to think about how we can exploit what the situation is that Congress has handed us in order to be able to drive learning. And I think Right to Try is potentially a tectonic event that will really usher in the golden age of the types of things I'm talking about, which is using drugs in interesting new ways for the immediate benefit of patients.
Dr. Tenenbaum, how does your AI-powered virtual trial platform compare with master protocol Bayesian adaptive trials such as iSpy, GBM Agile, and Precision Promise?
That's an excellent question. These adaptive Bayesian trials are really a major step forward in terms of, in many of these cases, they have an arbitrary number of arms, and they're trying to optimize the use, the allocation of a patient population to those arms in ways that will really drive approval of many new drugs. And of course, that's a good thing. On the other hand, I think until we can crack the problem of optimizing the drugs that we already have, that we're not going to make a major dent in cancer. In some sense, the 2001 cancer drug is not going to move the needle more than 1/2001, simply because these drugs will almost always be used in a combination with other drugs at the cutting edge of therapy. So what I'm talking about really could be viewed as deeply complementary to these Bayesian platform trials. Think about it this way. The platform trials are, let's say deeply complementary and extending these platforms to all patients on all treatments all the time. So the platform trials are trials, right? They're open at particular sites. They have inclusion and exclusion criteria, which may be looser than in the past because there are lots of arms to steer patients toward. But nonetheless, there will be a dropout one can expect of 40 or 50%. And between those two constraints, a patient not living near the site and the inclusion exclusion, the number of patients that these platform trials are going to reach is going to be limited. And the amount of agility in those platform trials, most of them are single arm, single drug per arm trials. So what we're doing is complementary in two ways. One is we can take all the patients that they are not able to handle, either because the patients don't live near them and can't go into them in the first place, or the patients drop out of the trial for whatever reason. They're in an arm and they fail and they drop out, to be able to take those patients and do some interesting experiments. And the other complementary way is to be able to, we can run small, pop-up studies of interesting new drugs, and almost as a sandbox to qualify drugs for later adoption as an arm within one of the platform trials. And conversely, when a drug graduates in the sense of a successful testing from one of these platform trials, we can then start experimenting with that drug in rational combinations in a very efficient way. So, I would say that, in the simplistic way, I like to think about these adaptive platform trials as an arm in our virtual trial, and conversely, our virtual trial as an arm in the platform trials. They're very complementary in that way. And if any of you are involved in one of the platform trials, you have my email. I want to hear from you.
How can big data initiatives such as Flatiron, CancerLink, and Project DataSphere contribute?
Okay, so I've talked about data at various times in my conversation, sometimes a little bit disparagingly to say, there is no data on the interesting things that haven't been tried yet. But I want to be clear, if we had access to data, it would be very helpful. Certainly for generating hypotheses on the one hand, for being able to do validation retrospectively before we try things prospectively, good for that. So if we can, in fact, get data, that would be very, very good. Having clinical grade real world evidence is absolutely essential to the kind of virtual trials that we're talking about. And these typically aren't, these databases are not used for clinical decision making. They're collected and sold off to pharma for target discovery or marketing, figuring out who's using what drugs. I think there's an opportunity to be able to tie all of these projects together in a way that actually will make them useful to clinicians, and in a way that doesn't disturb the business models of people who want to, monetize their data. So if you have data and you would like to be part of this, we are working with some of the organizations, in fact, all of the organizations that were in your question, in particular, to Project DataSphere, CancerLink, Flatiron, pulling these together in a way that's good for patients and actually in the end might even promote, increase the value of your data through some kind of commercial pooling. optional to be discussed. Please get in touch with me if you have those kinds of opportunities too. Is there another question?
Yes, it looks like we have time for one more. My company develops technology for early detection of cancer. How can we get involved and what are the benefits?
So this is, again, maybe speaking to the slide of saying, here's this ecosystem. I have a company. I didn't talk about early detection. It's certainly a very, very important thing. It's the focus of, some major companies like Grail and Guardant. And I'm going to answer this question in a slightly generalized way, which is whatever you're doing that relates to cancer in some way, I want you to think about how it might be helpful to the process that I'm talking about in terms of using these services as knowledge or constraints to guide the search. And if you're talking about, for example, early detection, it's likely that the technology and markers that you're working with for early detection can also be used for real-time monitoring of response to therapy. And if you think about, AI driving a search over possibilities, if you can get an early response, an early indication of whether a particular branch of the search is working, and if not, you can switch to a different branch in order to be able to get more shots on goal, that's hugely valuable to the overall efficiency of the search. So here's a case where you take something which is nominally not relevant to what I'm talking about, namely early detection, and turn it into something that is directly relevant, which is real-time monitoring. And so as a challenge to all of you, if you're working on things, and whether or not it's AI or not is irrelevant at this point, because we're going to use the AI to integrate your stuff in an efficient way. If you have something that could be helpful in terms of understanding what's going on in this patient and what to do about it, and how to monitor whether you're making progress or be able to increase the odds that it's going to work preclinically before you give it to the patient, we need you to be part of this ecosystem. Please, please get in touch.
Before we go, I want to let everyone know that today's webcast will be available for on-demand viewing through September of 2018. You will receive an email from LabRoots letting you know when this webcast will be available for replay. Please share that announcement with your colleagues who may have missed today's live event. That's all for now. Thank you for joining us, and we hope to see you again soon. Goodbye.